So maybe we can start. One note, if you are taking this class for credit, someone asked me what we mean by research proposal, so I just spent one minute on that. So if you want to take this class for credit, the way that we want to evaluate it, rather than having an exam or whatever, is if you can submit to us a research proposal. Think of it as 2 or 3 pages with a topic ideally related to this, one of these 3 set of lecture, credit, forms, or the macro. What's your question? What's your approach? If it's, it could be, it doesn't have to be super realistic in the sense that it could be a design for an experiment that you don't have money for, but it shouldn't be wild either. Ideally, especially if I understand correctly, if you're taking this course for credit, you're a PhD student, so it should be ideally something that is useful in the context of doing your PhD. If it's a model, what's the outline of your model, what it's supposed to deliver. If it's empirical work on existing data, what's the data. If you don't know what the data should be, it's like what the characteristic of the data that I would like to find are, something like that. Such that when we read this proposal, we think of it this way, is when we read this proposal, we should have something useful to tell you in exchange. If it's Castle in Spain, then we are not going to have much to say that's useful. If it's too vague, we're not going to have to say much that's useful. So that's the idea. At MIT, we do that for the macro class. The research proposal is part of the assessment, and in a lot of cases, actually, it has led to actual research papers down the line. So it's a useful exercise. If you have questions, you feel free to email us. We can discuss. But otherwise, that's the idea. So today is our third and last lecture on credit, which I'm going to devote to microcredit, in part because there is a lot of interesting work that has happened recently on this topic, and in part because it's an interesting, puzzling literature in a sense, in particular in view of what we discussed last time. So where we left it last time is that you have both from the ultra-poor experiments and the cash drops experiments on forms and the Blattman experiments about having people submit business plans and giving them money for that, seems to reasonably consistently show a picture where the return to capital seems to be quite high among people who have existing firms, and also among people who are induced by these opportunities to start a project, even people who have had no connection to the entrepreneurial world, like the ultra-poor, for example. And while there is some heterogeneity, it seems that almost everyone seems to gain. There is substantial heterogeneity, we'll go back to that, but it seems that almost everyone seems to gain, and the gains also seem to be quite durable, with the ultra-poor experiment following people for 7 years, the McKenzie, Demel, Woodruff going back after 5 years. We see these gains to be both large and persistent. So we should remember that. One thing that is worth pointing out, we'll keep that in mind also from that literature, we didn't spend much time on that, so that's why I'm insisting on it, is that it seems to be that in combination with some nudging to actually use the money or the assets towards the business, and maybe some help. So for example, in the ultra-poor experiments, it's this one big package where you give an asset and you provide some technical support to take care of your asset. You can translate that as you give 2 cows and you vaccinate the cows. But when you talk about asset and technical support, it looks more fancy, but that's really what it is. And you give people, you make people meet every week and talk about cows, and there is some maybe not so subtle pressure to keep the cows intact for the first, at least the first few months, etc. So obviously there has been an interest in trying to disentangle whether all of that monitoring is making a difference compared to just giving people, dropping a cow on people. So Dean Carolan, Abhijit Banerjee, and Chris Udry have a paper in Ghana where they compare cow drops with the ultra-poor program. So first of all is if you drop a cow on your head, it sort of hurts. Second of all, what they find is that when you give cows to people, people have more cows for a while. But nothing else really changes in a durable way. And in fact, over time, when you have the same 1.5 year, 3 years experiment, the assets, the level of the position in assets for the people who are given a cows but no over support is converging back to the control group. While in the treatment group, you have, the cows have had babies and then people have branched out in other businesses and the like. So it seems that the support and or the pressure to focus on the business was important in actually orienting people in the direction of the business. So I want you to keep that. So that's the one experiment there is that's really powerful enough, that has enough power to say something about that. It would be nice to have some more to see whether this is really robust. I'm sure if Blattman was teaching here, he would say, no, this is the money that matters and that's all. But in fact, all of his experiments have a lot of nudging as well. Like for example, in the Uganda experiment, people first have to write a business plan and then they are giving money for this business plan and then there are these groups of people. So right now, the evidence we have of this type of programs leading to more businesses and successful businesses is with some amount of prodding that you should go in that direction. It would be nice to have some more to see whether the cow drop experiment result is real. But for now, there is at least some suggestion of that. Another sort of direct suggestion is the Give Directly experiment, which gives pure cash with no indication that you should do anything with it other than whatever you please. And there are two forms of the grants. Either people get a small amount of money every month. So there you could think that it's very difficult for people to use that for a business because that would require first accumulating into a large quantity and then spend, which is hard for people for other reasons. So, but they also have a lump sum that they give in one shot. And even in a lump sum experiment, you see people making lumpy investment, but they tend to be lumpy investment of the form of durable consumption good, very important ones, like a roof. So it's not that they waste the money, but they don't go into, you don't have a big movement of the household, even given the lumpy investment towards businesses. So that's also another evidence that giving the per se all of these grants, either they are given to people who already have businesses, or if it's people who don't have businesses, they lead to businesses with a little bit of social pressure. So we'll keep that in mind. Now, if it is the case, and it seems to be the case, that there are these opportunities, people have those opportunities of going into profitable, possibly quite profitable self-employment business, then there should be a way to take advantage of this. But we've seen all of the difficulties in providing credit to the poor. Both the informal credit is riddled with asymmetric information problem. The banks have layers of that on top of that, so that's even worse. So there came the microfinance movement to say, okay, what we are going to do is we are going to provide an institutional innovation. Really think of it as in a fancy word again, like applied mechanism design. We are going to provide credit in a different way in order to reduce the monitoring cost, and that's going to therefore people will now be able to borrow, and since they have those profitable opportunities, it will be a sustainable venture once we manage to reduce the monitoring cost. So that's, I'm obviously paraphrasing the way that this was framed, but it's not that different. So, so the idea, and what is the institutional innovation? So the most well-known institutional innovation is group lending, although it has essentially gone away. So almost all of the current microcredit programs have abandoned group lending, or at least they have abandoned group liability. So initially, group lending meant joint liability, which you form a group of 5, and usually 5 group of 5 in a center, and people are jointly liable for reimbursing. So the idea is that, so the theoretical idea is that not only it reduces the monitoring costs because the people who are doing the monitoring have the information, but even better in the context of the model that we discussed, it offloads it onto households. So, and since it's not paid by the bank, you don't have the multiplier effect. So that was a beautiful idea. At the end of today, we'll discuss the extent to which group lending group joint liability was actually a very important feature of the microcredit empirically. In practice, it has vanished. So that can already give you an idea that maybe it was not such an important feature empirically. Because in practice, they are not doing it anymore. The reason why they're not doing it anymore is people hate it. But of course, they would probably continue to do it anyway if it was essential to the success. So if it's not group lending, what else is there? Dynamic incentives. So people start with very small loan, and the loan are built up over time, which builds an incentive to continue repaying. If you remember the Carlin-Zinman paper, that's the one thing that seems to provide incentive to people to really reimburse. There is, of course, a worry with that system, which is the typical Bülow-Rogoff type of worry in sovereign lending, which is you build your reputation, you build your reputation, you build your reputation up to the point where you've achieved enough of a loan that it's worthwhile cashing in on the reputation and walking away with the entire capital. So one mystery of microfinance is that this kind of hasn't happened, even though the growing of the loan is actually at some point stops. It's not that people have, there are some microfinance clients that have gigantic loans. So it stops at some point, and people yet, the repayment rate remains very high, so people have managed to that. So that's probably not just dynamic incentive is not the only thing that's happening. They're lending mostly to women. Today the portfolio is 84% women. We'll discuss the extent to which that's, the rationale for that is sort of threefold. One is women are more reliable. B, they should have higher return, marginal return to capital because they are more shut off from traditional options. So that's kind of the Yunus preferred argument is that, okay, the men have better access to the traditional bank, even if it's not great, and to money lender. So they should have opportunity to finance their projects, but the women don't. So presumably there are even better projects among women. So that was the idea. And the third is that maybe it's easier to put pressure on women to reimburse. Another feature of microfinance is, and one that is completely emphasized in the rhetoric of microfinance, but I think turns out to be actually a very essential innovation, is that the products are very, very simple and uniform. So everybody starts with a loan of the same size. Typically, you get your 10,000 rupees and you start reimbursing immediately, the week after, in a weekly installment that is the principal plus the interest divided in 50. So it is very, very simple to administer. And very, very simple also for people to understand what they are liable for. Then it becomes easy to monitor so you don't need to have an MIS. Many microfinance organizations were working on papers until probably they collapsed. At least in India, we had the partner that we evaluated their program. They had everything on papers until they vanished, and they didn't vanish because they had their record on paper. They vanished because of a fight that I'll describe in a minute. And you would think that's crazy, but in fact, if it's simple enough, it's like. So that is an administrative cost, but again, the administrative cost does it plays the same role as the cost of capital. If you can reduce the administrative cost, then you get the leverage over that. So by making the program super simple, they could hire people who were not very qualified, so not very well paid. So they can also reduce how much they're spending on wages. That also reduce the administrative cost. That again reduce the interest rate that they can charge via the multiplier effect. So this basic simplicity of the program, and then if you rethink of group lending in this way, there is a mechanical effect of group lending is that you show up one day in the village and you have, the entire village is reimbursing on that day. Not only that, but they're sitting like you in a room at 11:30 like you, and I come and I know I have to teach. I don't have to, gather every single of you individually. Same thing for microfinance. The microfinance guy shows up, everybody is there, and they give their money. If you go to group meetings, typically that's what happens. So the idea of, Grameen Bank, singing and dancing and talking about the Grameen resolutions and all that, essentially that's not what's happening in group lending. What's happening in group lending is you come, you give your money, typically to someone sitting in the first row, the credit officer takes it and goes away. So this is super efficient. And then so that helped a lot. And then the final thing is a huge focus on zero default. So where you start spending time, where the loan officer spends time, is to, if there is any default, to make sure that they get the money back. So if anyone is late, they will wait at their doorstep, they will pressure other people, they'll make sure they'll reimburse, so that, and for microcredit organization, that is an absolutely essential feature because they're worried about, explicitly worried, and we won't have time today to discuss it, but there is a very nice paper by Emily Breza showing that they are right to worry. They're very worried about multiple equilibria, that either everybody reimburses because that's the thing to do, or everybody will stop. And in fact, what happened in microfinance crisis, for example, in Andhra Pradesh in India, that they went from 99% or 100% repayment rate to zero, pretty much overnight, by shifting the equilibrium. I'll describe the anecdote in a minute. And then what Emily's paper does is that it starts from this zero repayment. So for a while, there was no repayment of microfinance. Everything collapsed in Andhra Pradesh. After a while, they could come back and try to reapproach the people that had borrowed from them and say, okay, if you reimburse now, we'll give you another loan. And when they did that, of course, the incentive to reimburse depends on how much is left for you to reimburse. Because if the promise is another loan, if you had paid 99% of your loan, you just pay another rupee and you get another 10,000 with maybe some chance that there would be a next crisis. So that seems worth it. But if you had reimbursed just 1 rupee, this is much more expensive for the promise of the other loan. So there are variation in individual incentive, and therefore variation in the incentive of other people in your village. And even though in that case the group structure had entirely vanished, people were approached individually, what she shows is that if in fact other people around you have strong incentive to reimburse, then conditional on your own incentive, you're also much more likely to reimburse. Which is to show that people are putting pressure and there is some social effect in their payment, which microfinance organizations were pretty convinced was the case. And therefore, they didn't want any default. That's going to be something to keep in the back of your mind because that probably has something to do with what we are going to find in terms of the impact of microfinance. The Grameen Bank was created in 1976. That's not the first microfinance instance in the world. They were credit cooperative in Germany in the 19th century. They are informal rotating and saving rotating saving and credit association in various parts of the world, including Africa, also for a long time. But it sort of gave it maybe a public image and a rationalization of what it was doing that was not there before. So in 2016, there were 100 billion outstanding microcredit and 132 million clients, almost 84% women, with the exception of some massive episodes like the one I mentioned in Andhra Pradesh, very high repayment rate. It has been, they were always, it's one of these type of organizations that claim the double bottom line, which have subsequently been, it's sort of a fad in the developing world of trying to get, let's say, the butter and the money of the butter, which is you are looking for a social outcome and you're trying to make money at the same time. So they have been successful in both fronts. Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize, presumably for a recognition of his social contributions. And then some microfinance institutions are profitable, some are extremely profitable. For example, Compartamos, which is a microfinance institution in Mexico, they did an IPO, and the amount of money they made for themselves rivaled what they could have made by starting a tech company in the US. And in fact, this has raised a lot of eyebrows, saying why are they making so much money, supposedly helping the poor, especially. And then what has happened after that, I don't know that they have a causal effect in that, the Compartamos guys, but after they did the Compartamos IPO, so some people were upset. Yunus was upset, actually. He was like, okay, you shouldn't make so much money. We should be profitable, but not like so profitable. But then other people took notice, and then, for example, it really emboldened the Indian microfinance organization, who decided that they also could make a lot of money. And there was an IPO of SKS in India that also made him a lot of money and raised a huge backlash. So the backlash in microfinance was in various countries, in different form of movements. There was a No-Pago movement in Latin America, basically leading a revolt of the borrowers. There was a lot of media emphasis on extremely poor outcomes among microfinance clients, such as suicide, etc. And then in India, that happened. The media backlash happened, which was followed by a political backlash. So both people from the bureaucracy and local politicians started to claim that in fact microfinance was terrible, that not only it didn't help the clients, but it hurt the client, and there are frequent waves of farmer suicide in India. Some of these farmers had borrowed from microfinance, so it becomes easy to say that it's the fault of microfinance, even though the counterfactual might be that they would, that another person who didn't take a microfinance loan committed suicide too. But when you have one single media story, of course you could emphasize the fact that they had borrowed. So what it did is that there was two episodes. There was sort of a first rehearsal in one district. The chief of that district ordered that people should not reimburse, and ordered the microfinance staff could not go to the villages anymore. So everybody defaulted in that one district, and the microfinance leaders met and they solved the problem and they could restart. But then a couple of years later, there was another crisis, also in Andhra Pradesh, which is the hotbed of microfinance in India. And in that case, again, microfinance repayment was made illegal, and in this case, most of the large microfinance organizations went bust, except SKS, which was the source of the problem in the first place, but managed to sneak their way out and are sort of still around. So there was this huge pendulum back where you went to, and now I think we are sort of back in the middle, both because of a moderation of the rhetoric of microfinance organizations, which are less claiming that they are the best thing since sliced bread and they are the new coming of mankind, and an understanding of maybe the limitation of what they can do, and a bit more oversight by regulatory agencies. So I think we're sort of back in the middle a little bit. So, yeah.
Is there any regulation related to salary discussion?
Yes, so one issue, so the regulation of microfinance, the place I know the best is India. The regulation of microfinance is a hugely contentious issue because early on, microfinance organizations were not subject to any particular regulations. In particular, they were not subject to the regulation that banks are subject to, which is know your customer type regulation, which goes by KYC, which is you are supposed to have, to know exactly who you are lending to. The microfinance organization, again, one way in which they keep things simple is they really know very little about who they are lending to. So that was left, that was left, they were not regulated. One regulation that they are facing is that they cannot take deposits because they are not deposit organization. In fact, for a while, they were anyway taking savings, arguing that still the same people who give deposit savings are the people who lend, so they are still in a net position of being a lender to them. So for a while that went through and then that got shut down, so now they are not allowed to regulate. After the Andhra Pradesh crisis, but there was no regulation, for example, on interest rate that they can charge. After the Andhra Pradesh crisis, what happened is that there was a commission that was set up for the regulation of microfinance organization, limiting what they can charge in interest rate and putting some benchmark on how much pressure they are allowed to put on clients to be reimbursed, to reimburse them, etc. So for a long time before this crisis, the microfinance organizations were absolutely adamant that they did not need to be evaluated, that you didn't need to look at the impact of microcredit on their clients. And in fact, this is still the position of Mohamed Yunus, that there's no business looking at the causal impact of getting a loan on people who get it. And the reason is that since a lot of these microfinance organizations are profitable, it has to be that their clients find it useful, otherwise they wouldn't be coming back. So there is no reason to evaluate the causal effect of a car manufacturer, because if they produce a car that's useless, nobody is going to buy the car, and the market is going to tell you that it was useless. So that was the argument, which is we are profitable organizations. Once we stop making profit, it suggests that we are not doing anything useful. So this argument was wrong on two levels. The first one is that although they are profitable, they are profitable in a context where there is a lot of subsidies, implicit and explicit, towards the movement. So the implicit subsidies is that many people choose to, work for microfinance organization, make less money than they would otherwise have made. The explicit subsidy is that microcredit sometimes get cheaper capital than they would otherwise have been getting. For example, in India, microcredit qualifies as priority sector. So if you're a bank and you're facing the type of incentives problems that we were discussing before, and you find it very difficult to find farmers to lend to, not only it's priority sectors, but it's rural priority sector, because within the priority sector, there is also a sub-component of rural that needs to be satisfied separately. And microcredit, even urban microcredit, is rural priority sector. So for the bank, instead of having to find a farmer one by one, what they did is the equivalent of a mortgage-backed security, which is they bought in bulk claims from microcredit organization. And that's where the regulation thing is very dicey, because the microcredit organization did not have any knowledge on the customer, did not have the know your customer forms, etc. But then they resold those loans to the securitized and resold those loans to the bank, and now these loans are on the book, individually on the book of the banks. So, but the customers is not known, which created that regulation issues, which eventually forced the microfinance organization to collect this information. But what this means is that the bank found it really wonderful to lend to microfinance organizations. They get perfect, or they got perfect before those crises, perfect repayment rates without having to do anything. So this is much better than paying either paying the penalties by lending to the government at 0 interest rate or trying to look for clients. That means that the cost of capital for microcredit organization was much, much, much lower than what it would have been in the absence of subsidies. There is nothing wrong with that, per se. That's not bad. Why not? If they are better at finding clients, they should, go and find the clients. But once you acknowledge these subsidies, then you have to look in exchange whether that's something that is worth doing or something that is not worth doing. So that's an argument that has been, so before we did the first impact evaluation of microcredit, we tried to convince microcredit organization of that fact, and that one day it's going to bite them back if they refuse to find the impact, and it was very, very difficult, because while the going was good, it was good. So that's the first type of argument. The second type of argument is more saying, well, maybe the clients are not fully rational, and it's more the argument that got brought to the fore when there was all these horror stories in the media about committing suicide and the like. So the idea is that the microfinance organization actually luring people into borrowing when they cannot reimburse, they don't have projects, or they just consume, and then they find themselves with these huge debts, and it's like, crack cocaine is profitable, but still we think it's bad for people, even though they are going there, and rationally they shouldn't. So that's, so possibly microfinance, if the consumer of microfinance are not fully either informed or rational or in their taking the loans, then they could hurt people. So now what are the impacts on microcredit? So to cut a long story short, there was about 10 years where we were desperately trying to find partners to evaluate microcredit and failed. And the first wave of discontent were really helpful in trying to finally convince some people to say, well, maybe we should look at the impact of microcredit. So what happened is that there were a lot of evaluation of microcredit that were done by separate teams in different places, more or less at the same time, in the same 5 to 7 years interval. And contrary to the ultra-poor program that I discussed last time, or in the first lecture, where there was a concerted movement effort to do these studies in different contexts, there it happened a little bit organically. And this is one little role that I played, is that at some point I realized that these studies were coming. And I thought that it would make more sense to, instead of publishing one here, one there, it would make more sense to try and put them together in one place and to force them to report the outcomes in a similar way. So I was editing the AEJ at the time, and I wrote to everybody who was involved in one of these studies. It helped that I was involved in a couple of them myself, so I could say, I'm going to put my own studies there, you put your own, and was able to get 7 studies in the same issue of the AEJ with the same table and the same and the same definition of the outcomes. So it helps because first of all they can be combined, as I'm going to describe in a minute, and second otherwise, individually, what each paper was trying to do is to find an angle to show how they were different from the others. Well, in fact, the story about these studies is not that they each had an angle that they were different from the other, is that they actually told the same thing. So just in terms of the incentive in publishing, sometimes will pull you in a somewhat wrong direction. So people were kind of emphasizing some little quirk in the thing, which may or may not be generalizable, when the big story was just about the plain vanilla treatment effect, that are they or are they not comparable across studies? Yeah.
I wonder whether it's not whether it's a little bit complicated to compare the different outcomes stemming from the different studies, because and actually I think it's a little bit complicated to evaluate the past of selling from microfinance because of selection bias, for example. We don't know when we cannot identify the two objectives that the client wants to achieve.
Well, so the point is that all of these are randomized control trials. So all of them at least have causal effects that are internally valid. And then at least if the outcomes are defined in the same way, then at least we can look at how things are different or not from context to context. And if they differ, we can try and explain why. So that's kind of what happened. So 6 of these studies were published in the AEJ, and then there was one more before on the Philippine Carlin study, which appeared in Science. So that gives us a group of 7 at the time. Each of these studies are randomized control trials, and they are one of 2 designs. Either it's a place-based randomization, where the MFI agreed to select twice as many villages for an expansion in a new area than they would have normally gone to, and then you randomly select which one the microcredit is given to. So that's model 1. I think 4 out of 6 have that model. And then there is randomization in the bubble, which is at the individual level. So the way it works is that you let people apply. Anybody who is looks to be a superb, you rank them using credit rating. Anybody who looks to be a superb client, the MFI want to lend them to, they get lent to. Anybody who looks like he's going to be terrible or she's going to be terrible, the MFI doesn't lend to them. And in the middle, in the bubble, you randomize, where there is some indifference because it's not that the credit rating systems are so perfect that in the middle you have perfect discrimination between good guys and bad guys. So that's another, by the way, a useful innovation that can be used in a lot of settings where because you can replace microcredit by eligibility based on scores for a scholarship. You can replace credit rating by eligibility based on your poverty index. And whenever there is some amount of uncertainty about how good your underlying index is, organization would be willing to give you a bit of slack in the middle. Okay. So one of the issues with both of this design is that the place-based randomization, usually the microcredit organization will still say that they want to lend some place. And then they will accept randomization in other places where they are somewhat indifferent. So in a sense, the place-based randomization are also a little bit in the bubble, which is you don't get randomization in the most desirable place. So for example, when we studied the effect of microcredit in Morocco, for each new branch, there was a circle drawn around the branch where the MFI went and promoted microcredit. And it's at the border where the villages became eligible for being randomized. So a little bit further away from the main place of the branch. In Hyderabad, it was when we did Spandana, it was the same thing where they went to the huge slums because that's efficient for them. But the smaller slums where they didn't really care whether they would go or not go, they would randomize across those. So that's relevant because it means that all of these studies give you the impact of microcredit, first of all, among new borrowers by definition, because they'll never kick someone out randomly, and among new borrowers who are somewhat marginal. Either they are marginal because they hardly qualify based on the credit score, or they are marginal because they live in an area that the MFI is indifferent towards lending to. Okay? I want to keep that in mind because that's common across all of the studies. So when I'm going to show you in a minute big external, like a lot of external validities of the study in the sense that they seem to all say the same thing, which is that nothing happens. This is still in that among the marginal clients. So in a minute I'll say something more about do we have any evidence for that. So there is a summary of those study in an introduction of the paper. Two things: the take-up rate are not very large. So the RCTs that randomize at the geographical level, they get about 10 percentage point increase in take-up of microfinance between treatment and control area, which correspond roughly to 10% client because the take-up is low in control group. So it's not. So it tells you it's a first-order fact, which is that the demand for micro-client, even among, so typically these studies survey people who look like they would be eligible. So, for example, when households that have a woman of the right age group that is not currently employed, something like that, that's kind of the, if the MFI is insisting on owning your own home, which is often the case, owning your own home, the study restricts to those people. But of course, you cannot survey the client of microfinance and random people in the treatment group and random people in the control group. Otherwise, you would have wasted your nice randomization design. You have to survey like with like. So the only thing you can do is to survey eligible people in treatment and eligible people in control. And if the take-up is only 10%, then your reduced form is going to be whatever is the impact of microfinance multiplied by 10%. So the power, almost all of these studies struggle for power, which is, this is so hard to get people to agree to randomize and to then run around the whole world, and then you survey these people, and most of them are kind of useless from a statistical point of view, and it's sad, but that's the way it is. So it's nice also to have 7, because since each of these studies is not exactly swimming in power, it is nice that there are more so that we can try and combine them. So now let's talk about combining them. So this is a nice study by Rachel Meager, which is forthcoming in the AJ applied as well in another one, where she is applying the tools of Bayesian hierarchical modeling to think about how to combine the study. So why do we need to applying those tools? Well, you could say, well, I'm going to take the entire data set and run one big regression, where I'm going to take all the 7 studies, treat it as one big data set, put site fixed effect, and run big regression, and that's a way of combining them. But of course, in that case, you're making the assumption that the treatment effect doesn't vary by site. And you are preventing yourself to find out whether or not it varies by site. And a key question that often comes up when people discuss a randomized control trial is, what's the external validity of a single trial or of a set of studies, by which people mean the treatment effect that you're getting in one site, to what extent is it predictive of the treatment effect you would get in a different site? So how to answer these questions? So first of all, the only way that you can answer this question is to have the same or similar studies run in different places. So that's a nice setting, because we have those 7 studies, the same program, very different context, from Bosnia to Ethiopia to urban India. So we have rural context, urban context, Europe, Africa, India. So we have a variety of contexts, so that's nice. And then the problem is that every time you run a study, you're going to get 1 point estimate and 1 standard error around that point estimate. And they could vary from studies to study for 2 reasons. Because of sampling variation, because the actual underlying effect is different, which is the question of that external validity is asking, which is are the effect of each study very specific to that context? And then the other thing that could happen is that in addition, you've got noise. So when you're looking at your data, you're seeing different in point estimate across sites. But that's a combination of 2 things. A combination that for each site you have your estimate of the treatment effect for that site plus noise. and your estimate comes with its own set of noise. And then in addition, there might also be true variability between sites. And the key question is, how do we distinguish the two? So there is a paper by Pritchett and Sandefurs, a little small paper in the PNP, which gets it entirely wrong by saying, well, I'm looking at it 7 studies and they have different point estimates. Well, yeah, but they also have standard error. So it is not that the point estimate tells me that the effects are different. This is assuming that as if we had no sampling variability, that would be lovely. But that's not the way the world is. We had a lot of sampling variability. So what we need to do is to find a way to separate these two.